Welcome back to the Belonging at Work Summit. Our next guest is a friend, mentor, fellow trans advocate, and a legend among legends when it comes to fighting for trans rights in the United States. None other than Kylar W. Broadus. So Kylar, if you're not familiar with his work, is the founder and director of the Trans People of Color Coalition, which is the only national organization dedicated to the civil rights of transgender people of color. Kylar is on the board of the National Black Justice Coalition, where for 3 years he was board chair, and he currently serves on the Freedom for All Americans Board of Directors. Among many of his awards, and there are many of them, he was recently recognized by The Advocate as one of the 25 legal advocates fighting for trans rights. He was also honored to stand with President Obama while signing the executive order adding protections for millions of LGBT contract workers in 2014. And during my time serving as policy director at PFLAG National in 2012, I had the privilege of watching history be made by Kylar as he testified before the United States Senate. And he was the first out transgender American to do so, supporting at the time the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So I can seriously go on and on about how incredibly talented Kylar is and what a gift his voice has been for the movement for transgender rights in the United States. To maximize our time, though, we're going to be focusing our conversation with Kylar on why he believes storytelling, and in particular diversity storytelling, is so powerful to win over more hearts and minds to understanding a perspective that is different from their own. So with that, Kylar, welcome to the summit. I am super, super honored that you said yes to this interview. And I know we are all going to be transformed from the knowledge and wisdom that you share with us today. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Rose, and thank you for having me. I feel always honored to be in the space to share, and share with you is even more special. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks. And so let's just kick this off. And can you help us just in your own words to better frame the conversation? Can you share what you believe a diversity story is?
A diversity story is something that does touch another person's heart. It touches them in a way that they've never been touched before. And it's bringing something to them that they've never experienced. And ironically, I used to do this even with people that weren't of color when I was a pre-law advisor. And they'd say, I don't have anything diverse about me. There's nothing diverse. And we'd sit down and we'd talk, and there would be, because I had always had a hidden disability that people didn't know about. I was a person that pocketed my life because I lived across worlds. I was an activist, I was a teacher, and I was a lawyer. And so those worlds didn't always intersect. And so people always didn't know certain things. And so I would pull out, oh, they didn't know I was disabled. And they're like, wow, you're disabled. And it's like, yeah, all disabilities aren't shown. And I would give them the example of me having to have the bagger at the grocery store rebag, because then I was much heavier. I hadn't gotten ill and lost a lot of weight, but I was very muscular. Mm-hmm. And the baggers would look at me in the grocery store and ask me why I wanted the bags rebagged, because then I'd have to carry, my kitchen was upstairs in my house. I had a house that was 2 levels, but the kitchen was upstairs. Yeah. And that was something as simple as that would resonate with folks to go, oh, I do have something unique about me to share with others, or that would touch them in a unique way to find something in them that would resonate or connect them to me and make them see the human kind in me for them to connect.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I really appreciate that in terms of what you're talking about. And in particular, when working with your students, and this was when you were living in Missouri as a law professor, right? So kind of working with students to make sure that, you know, they're seeing the value that they have from their own lived experiences. And, you know, we'll get later in this conversation of how we our audience can excavate their own diversity stories. I think what you're sharing is really powerful, and it encourages people to remember that we all carry really powerful experiences, and just by looking at us, we can't always we don't know the whole story until we build relationships and start talking and being curious about who the person is who's standing before us, and kind of sharing your own experiences of having an invisible disability is a really powerful example of that. Now that we have kind of like this basic understanding of a diversity story, I was hoping that you could share a little bit more about your experiences of being the first out transgender person to ever testify before the U.S. Senate in support of workplace protections for transgender people. And in particular, how did you leverage your own diversity story as a Black transgender man from Missouri to open more hearts and minds to support critical workplace protections for obviously trans people, for LGBT people broadly, in front of many senators who may have never met a trans person before?
That's a very good question, and one that I had to grapple with.
Yeah.
I knew that I could only tell my story, but I also wanted to tell a story that reflected many lives. And I felt that that was my obligation, that I was also representing many transgender people, not just a trans masculine Black man going in to tell a story.
Yeah.
So my dilemma was, how do I tell many stories through my story?
Yeah.
And that made it a daunting task for me. So I tried to, and I feel like I was successful once I heard critique from many people that came up after me, put that in my story. And I had lots of practice, because in my day, people didn't pay to hear our story.
Yeah.
But we pushed our story on people so that they could see the human kindness of it. And what I mean by my day is that the old protocol was for us to blend in and not tell our stories, which I don't think is healthy for anybody to live with secrets.
Yeah.
And I, by taking the power and coming out and living and coming out, especially in the time that I did, where very few people came out, we were the generation that was the first generation to come out and be visible as trans people. Owning our truth is very important to me. So I think that that was the important issue, is that we're telling and sharing our truths to people. And also that people needed to understand that we're all human beings. So that was the basic couple of premises I used to tell my story, but also still thinking the biggest thing of putting in everybody's story and making it universal when I did that. And I can just think of a couple of things that I used, and I remember a couple of things I said that really weren't correct, but they were in the emotions of the moment. Which was that every day when you wake up, it's like putting on armor and going out the door to be a trans person. And it truly is. No matter what level you are as a trans person, it is the same in doing that, because you don't know what you're going to experience, how people are going to treat you, and you have to always have shields up to be present for whatever might happen. And so I tried to unify that message by telling my story and then sharing stories that made it emotional, because we live emotional lives, not knowing what's going to be put before us every single day, whether all the microaggressions and then the mass aggressions. And we must all realize that as trans people, that all of us are marginalized, and that's the story we tell. And some of my students were surprised that I showed such emotion, but that's the understanding of storytelling, is that I lived that emotion. So I had to share that emotion to connect with the people that needed to hear that, because at that time, we weren't at a trans tipping point where everybody understood or knew or we were visible to trans people. We were just getting to that point. And I wanted them to understand the severity of how it impacted our lives. And I know, being one of the first trans people out news camera followed me every single day, and so did the newspaper people every single day, just to say transsexual burps at 10 or 11, which was ridiculous, but I didn't bother me. But back to the point of that was very huge to us as a trans movement, because it was the first time we were being heard, and the senators wanted to hear what we were experiencing, our lives were like day to day, and they needed to know the emotionality that was involved, or that is involved, in being trans on a daily basis, and how we don't know if none of us know if we're going to live tomorrow, but particularly as a trans person in this country.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in what you just shared, and a few things that I think might be helpful just to lift up for folks watching. One, we will absolutely make the testimony that you shared before the Senate available, because I think that's powerful in and of itself, and how you were able to balance both your own lived experiences. So you're leading with your own story, and you had mentioned that challenge that you're one person, you're not, and our communities are certainly not monoliths, right? Like, we're not all the same,
No,
so you had, so you had this balance of just such an incredible career, and you still have an incredible career in what you're doing, on top of experiencing many different forms of employment discrimination. So making the case based on your own emotional, like, connecting with other hearts about how you endured really systemic discrimination in your career, your legal career in particular, but then balancing that your story, while it is unique to you, there are some similarities that other trans people experience, which is employment discrimination, underemployment, navigating poverty. These are very, very real experiences for far too many trans people, a disproportionate number of trans people. And I think you did that really expertly, of kind of leading with your heart, leading with your story, sharing some facts and statistics just to kind of frame it, to kind of frame the experiences of trans communities more broadly. And then also, giving a request to the senators and to Congress as a whole of passing, at that time, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So you're kind of using these different approaches depending on who the audience is, of what will kind of move them to take some kind of action to make things better, so that the next generation of trans folks hopefully do not have to endure the kind of pervasive discrimination that still exists in the workplace. And so I really think you just did such an expert job in that. And based off of that experience, what kind of impact did it have on the legislators? Was there anything that surprised you the most after you delivered your testimony, that really stood out for you?
Well, I tell you, even before, and I've got Bill's palsy going on in my face, so I have to say that to the people viewing this. So got a few quirky reactions with my face. But I tell you, even before, this man was waiting for me in the doorway, and I had no idea. I was just trying to get to the room, and this mass of people were following me in. And my good buddy was with me, thank goodness. It was somebody that, was there, and I'll name him Shannon Mentor.
Yeah.
I had no idea who was going to go with me. And that morning I woke up and he says, "Okay, buddy, what time are we going?" And I was like, "Thank you very much." Because as many things as I've done on my own, that was really daunting to have this task to do, and nobody to back me up, because I've been in very many things pertaining to this community and done it alone.
Yeah.
So it was great to have my buddy by my side.
Yeah.
And could you jog my memory? I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, just after you delivered your testimony, was there something that just surprised you in how people received your story? Did they reflect back something that just kind of made you feel like, yes, the emotional labor that went into sharing my story, I know I had this impact, and this is changing a few hearts and minds?
Yes, it did. I was, I'm not going to deny I've learned to be a good storyteller just through the years,
Yeah.
but I wanted affirmation that I hit a home run for the people that I was representing. I've always taken this work to not be about me, but for others. Um, and Rhodes knows this because he knows me, but not many people in this generation do. And the work has never been about me. It's about stopping the pervasive discrimination and hate that goes on, because I never wanted anybody to incur any of the things that I've experienced.
Yeah.
So it was great to hear from the senators, number one, and they were shocked and dismayed at the things that I had encountered. And I remember Senator Harkin, which is a neighbor to me at my home state in Missouri, saying, my gosh, all these things, and Senator Merkel and all the other senators, and they were invested, and it didn't matter what moniker that they have, Republican, Democrat, or independent. And I think when we touch those people and they hear these stories and they hear our lives, it doesn't matter what they are, they get it, that we are human too, and that this is part of the human condition as any other condition of human life.
Absolutely.
And it touched them, and that was great. But more importantly, when I left that room and I got tons of text and commentary back from young trans people, persuasions, non-binary, because I've lived that, and that's what people don't understand, the progression.
Yeah.
Binary, doesn't matter what side of the binary. They said, you told my story.
Yeah.
That's when I knew I did a good job.
Oh yeah.
And that made me feel like I hit a home run.
Yeah.
And that was most important to me, that I got those comments back from trans people of all socioeconomic stratas, of all races, and of all persuasions of the gender spectrum, that said, you told my story.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's what put me in tears when I left there. And I said, okay, I did what the mission was to do. And I was happy to do that, because as I took on the job, we say I was the first known out trans person. I always believed there were people there before me doing the work, whether they were out or not. And I always look at this work that way.
Yeah.
And I'm just the next one in line that has the privilege of doing the work. And I want to do it well on behalf of all people, so that we get this and can move forward in good faith.
Absolutely. And I mean, the challenge that you had was to make sure that you were not only just sharing your story, sharing stories of many different trans, non-binary communities, and that affirmation, after being vulnerable and putting yourself out there, which is the art of storytelling, is you're taking a risk, right? And you're calculating. You took a very public risk in front of the United States Senate, and that kind of the immediate response after you took the risk was, positive affirmation, both from the audience you were trying to persuade, the senators across political spectrum, and and hearing from community, like you did it, and just kind of from all different generations, racial backgrounds, across the country, and having been there to watch you, I had goosebumps the entire time, and I think that that's just the power that story, just sharing your story really brings. And I think that extends to, one of, I think, a shining professional superpower that you have, which is sharing your story across differences. So you talked about, talking to senators across the political divide in this country, at least, but also across cultural differences. So I think you're really skilled talking, sharing your story across different races, genders, and classes, and in particular in different geographies in this country, right? So when you're because you are so good at doing this, I'm curious for you, like, what are some of the biggest challenges that arise when you deliver your diversity story to different groups of people? And how do you navigate them, right? So if you're talking to an audience with, it's a mixed audience, people from all over the country, all different racial backgrounds, different genders, and you're trying to share, you're trying to raise awareness around trans communities and some of the challenges that we experience. Where do you see some of those challenges of just trying to make connection, and then how do you work around them?
Well, it's interesting because before I did a lot of work and before the internet, I would go into those rooms and never come out as trans.
Yeah.
And I worked them very differently.
Yeah.
So that I would allow people to own all their biases. And I would say, oh, just load it up, bring it on. If you're in the KKK, that's fine. There's no judgment here. Just bring it on. And people would list all their judgments and negativities about other people. And by the time they got done listing those, the people themselves started to realize how ridiculous and apathetic and sad after I would work the group that those things sounded, by minimizing other people. And they got that because I would work the group to the point where they got to that point, and that they were just belittling other people because there was something about themselves that was going on. So I would work the group that way, and eventually I would come out. And I actually did this on the campus that I taught on, because I came out on the campus that I taught on, and I never thought that would happen since it was religiously affiliated. But that's where I ended up. And what happened at the end of these sessions that I would do trainings before the internet caught up with me was people found out it just made no difference to them. And it would get heated because, the Bible would be bought in, and I'd say, okay, well, who wrote the Bible, and talk about that. And I luckily have a cousin who's a minister who, then taught me a couple of verses, because I'm not that well versed because I can't remember everything, that he says, God doesn't say that about, the stat. And I had earlier had experience working with the RAC, the Jewish Reform folks. So I learned some of their information that is supportive of trans people. So I learned these things along the way and would use those tools in the room.
Yeah.
Now, I have always been out, but so the internet caught with me, so I had to work groups a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I have is my voice changes with the crowd.
Yeah.
I sound cosmopolitan in a cosmopolitan arena, and I am a rural boy. So my twang just comes out in a rural arena because it's my natural voice.
Right.
And honestly, that sells a long way. And I don't do it purposely. It just comes right out.
Yeah.
So honestly, I think that happens. And it's the skill to connect with people immediately on a common ground that may not be the issue at hand at first. And that's how I learned. And honestly, I learned this a long time ago, and I had many a good teacher, but my best teacher was my mother, who could work a crowd anywhere.
Yeah.
And get them to do anything, including eat out of her hand. And I would just watch her work a crowd. And that's where I learned how to work a crowd and work a room.
Yeah.
So what I'll do before a speech, especially if it's going to be, and I've done this when I've had to go into, say, a Black church. And people are afraid, they're like, and I had somebody say, oh my God, because I saw this somewhere else. I said, oh no, that's not a problem for me. And so I'll work the crowd before I do the speech. I work the room before I do the speech. So they've met me once already. They've shaken my hand, they spoke to me, and they've talked to me.
Yeah.
And then I get up, and whatever their twist is, I talk about it and give it respect. But then I talk and take a take off of whatever they're doing and talk about how respect must be extended to X, Y, and Z, whether it's a school board, which I've done tons of school boards for trans children, or if it's a church meeting.
Mhm.
And that it's all about liking people. And sadly, that's what it turns to, and then getting them to like what you're talking about. Does it
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're kind of leaning with, uh, and definitely pre-internet, it's a little bit difficult to do the research, but once you actually get to a space, building in that time in advance, like you said, learning from
Right.
your mom, who's in the room, like making conversations, being curious about the folks that are in the room, understanding what's important to them. And I mean, this is where your skill and talent comes in, and just like the wisdom that you bring is being able to be quick on your feet to then kind of
Bingo.
connect the dots of like, okay, you care about respect and fairness, and guess what, so do the communities that I represent, and so let's build a bridge. And I think that's that just comes with experience, and I think that's helpful for folks thinking about, okay, i want I want my CEO to care about belonging in the workplace. Like, how do I make that case? And I think that's like, figure out how to connect those dots of what's important to your CEO, what's important to the values of your organization, what's important to you and other colleagues, and then try to pivot and make that case in a creative way. Something that you
Uh,
had mentioned that I just want to go back to is on
sure.
this topic of um, purposeful disclosure. So you had talked about like pre-internet, people can't Google Kylar Broadus to figure out like who you are in the world. So who you are is who you are, and people may see you and they may never know until you say otherwise, like aspects of your gender history. So they wouldn't necessarily know that you're a trans guy. And so like, I'm curious for you now, even though like publicly you're very out, I imagine still when you meet random people like on the street, they may make assumptions about your gender. So talk to us a little bit about the value of purposeful disclosure. Certainly we're talking about it from the trans perspective, but you used a great example in the beginning of this interview of having an invisible disability. So that's another thing that you may purposefully disclose once you build trust with people. But how do you assess like your own personal safety first before you know that it's okay to kind of share really, really important aspects of who you are, but you want to make sure that the folks that you're sharing this with are going to take care of that information. I think if you could share just a few strategies of how to assess safety and when to purposefully disclose aspects, dimensions of our diversity that can be vulnerable, but if we share them, it could build really powerful bridges, like your testimony before the US Senate. So what are some strategies that you use?
And I just want to dovetail back for a minute, if you don't,
Yeah.
on the last one.
Oh, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Pre-research is important, and I do want to emphasize that pre-research is important
Yep.
to where you're going, the crowd you're dealing with, or your CEO, and what your CEO likes to do in their spare time, because those personal things matter. Their kids, I came up in corporate America, and you learn a lot wherever you come up through. Nonprofits are very different, but corporate America, you learn a lot of ways and you get a lot of trainings. And so we learn like, how many kids does your CEO have, this, that, and the other. And I know you remember those things, and that's how you make those personal connections to get to the next level with people.
Oh,
So
yeah.
just going back.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I'm glad you're talking about like just knowing your audience a little bit better. And on that, it's kind of who your audience like I mean, we have the advantage of the internet now, for better or worse. I mean, you can Google people and figure out, okay, I'm talking to this organization, or I'm making this presentation to our leadership team. There's a few new people, they just joined the team. Read their bios, learn what's important to
Yeah.
them, and kind of sprinkle that into what you're talking about so that you can build trust that way. I think that's really important. And I think for you and I, having spent time in DC in particular, or even in our own respective states, trying to lobby or advocate to different elected officials, that's also really important, of understanding, who you're talking to. I remember when I worked at the Office of Management and Budget, like one of the directors at the time was Rob Portman, and one of his sons recently came out as gay, right? So like being able to connect that way of like, oh, I worked at PFLAG and you're a PFLAG parent, whether you know it or not, and just
Exactly.
and being able to make those connections, I think that's really, really good advice. And it's relatively easy to do. I mean, I think if we were doing this, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we may have to go through newspaper clippings and other things, but, a quick Google search doesn't hurt before you
Right.
talk to an organization or an individual. So
And
I
it can
really
be
appreciate it.
helpful. Sorry
Yeah.
to continue to talk, but it can be helpful because you don't want to walk into a time bomb either, and
Yeah.
something that you shouldn't be wandering into. So,
Right,
yeah,
right. And I think in the context of, knowing the audience who's tuning in right now, I view everyone who's registered and who's watching this as a belonging champion. So it's people who really want to shift workplace culture where folks like ourselves, like for trans people or for other underrepresented folks in the workplace who have historically not been considered, like where we can feel like we can show up as our whole selves. We're respected for what we bring to the organization. We're advancing the organization's mission. It's really important for those of us kind of here to understand how do we make the case of why this is so important to the future of our organizations. And sometimes we have to do that to our leadership team where their main focus might not be this, and we need to help them see in their best interest like this is a part of it, achieving whatever that bigger mission of the company or the organization is. So
right. And that's key. You're right on it.
yeah.
So, but those were just two important points I wanted to highlight.
Yeah.
Now, back
Yeah.
to the next question you were on to.
Yeah. So on disclosure, so I call it purposeful disclosure. So if we're thinking about, in the case of talking about your gender history, right? You might be before an audience, say they didn't do their internet research, they have no idea who you are. How do you know when you're in a room, and when we were talking about challenges before, you might be in a room that might be a little hostile, right? To trans people. At what point do you feel like, how do you assess your safety, your physical safety, your emotional safety of when you take that risk to share an aspect of your diversity story? So in this instance, like your gender history. What are a few tips that you could give to folks who want to be strategic about sharing, if they have an invisible disability, for example, and they want HR to care about people with disabilities broadly? Um, what advice would you give to a person like that to assess, when the timing is right to share that information?
Very good question, and it's difficult for a lot of folks to do. And I've dealt with people and helped them come out over the years because we had to figure out a good way to do that for folks, and
Yeah.
there wasn't a way to do that when I came out.
Yeah.
Uh, so one of the things I would say is timing is everything, and it's important to figure out when that is for people in the workplace.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to assess, right, what the environment is in your workplace to see what's going on, who is there a policy in place. If there isn't a policy in place, then you may have to do some work outside and some research to bring a policy to the organization. Because if it doesn't feel safe, then you want to get something that's in writing in place that will help protect you.
Yep.
And so there are lots of models and samples out there. There are lots of consultants now. I used to do it all the time for free, and now we're charging, but everything costs money and it takes time and it's a lot of work to get this stuff done, but it can be done. And lots of employers are open to it if employers are looking for solutions, not problems.
Yep.
And you have to remember that. So if you come in with solutions, most employers are fine with solutions. And most employers realized since the late 90s that diversity is the way to go. They want the best workers. And the third thing is they don't want lawsuits. So if you come in with solutions and you're not disrupting the workplace and you work to build bridges with the right people that you see that are favorable in the workplace, whether it's an HR or a manager that's favorable. I found, in my workings, I had the support of a manager, and then tried to work the process from there, then I think you'll be fine. But I do think that you have to think about disclosure, and you have to think about it very carefully.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So a couple of things just to kind of lift up. You talked about timing is everything. So you have to assess for yourself, is this the right time? And kind of finding fellow champions within your organization, right? In terms of
Yes.
who you have already built some trust and rapport with, and maybe share a little bit more about yourself, see how they react to that, and then
I
talk
agree.
about, right, like, kind of, for you wearing your lawyer hat is kind of assessing, are there protections for you on the basis of what you might be sharing? So if you're coming out around your sexual orientation or your gender identity, if you're sharing something about your ability, that might be invisible to others, you want to make sure that there are protections before kind of sharing more broadly, so that in addition to adding those protections, you can do some education around how the workplace can be more inclusive of folks like yourself. I think those are really good starting points. And again, as you know, in doing this work, every organization, every culture is a little different. So
So
there is some subjectivity around the order of operations, so to speak. So, but I think that's a really good starting place. Another thing that I really liked what you said is employers are looking for solutions, not problems. The previous day, we talked with Howard Ross, and he was talking about how employers or folks in the workplace more broadly get exhausted by the idea of fixing something. And something that you also said is the power of building. Like if we're building something together, if we're building a workplace of belonging, we're centering
right.
that as a value. People get inspired by building and innovating, right? We don't necessarily
Yes.
get inspired by like, oh my God, we have to fix this problem, right? So I
Right.
think that just kind of underscoring that is really important. So thank you for that. I wanted to pivot with like the time remaining to just lift up some other work that you're doing now. So the Employment Non-Discrimination Act has since evolved into this new, more comprehensive kind of add-on to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is the Equality Act, in which it would add sexual orientation, gender identity protections at the federal level, in a number of different areas, including employment. And you have been working with Speaker Pelosi's office in advocating for this legislation. Talk to us a little bit more about your work with Speaker Pelosi's office and other folks in Congress more broadly, around getting people to be supportive of the legislation by centering stories and centering diversity stories, and in particular talking about LGBT folks' experiences in these different areas of life, from housing to employment to trying to get a loan. Like how do stories help with winning over more legislators with this particular bill? Just from your own experience.
Okay. Well, and yeah, I've done some work on this bill, and yeah, it will be fantastic if it's passed. And House has already introduced it, and
Yep.
I do think it'll be a go for us because it's time. And I think that whatever the goings on in Washington, this bill will get through at some point in time quicker than INDA. I think we've done all the education we need. But back to your point
Mm-hmm.
of the work being done, stories are so important. You cannot have legislation passed without stories. And it's sort of like you can have legislation, but you can't have change without cultural shift. And
Mm-hmm.
we've had a lot of the cultural shift, which is why it would seem, or it seems like the Equality Act will pass a lot sooner than INDA will pass. And the protections are badly needed because we can't keep up this piecemeal litigation from
Mm-hmm.
state to state, and some places have protections and some don't. So it would
Right.
be nice to have that clear in a statute from Congress saying that all people have the same rights. We're not asking for anything different. We're just asking to be treated the same.
Yeah.
And so that's the wonderful thing about the Equality Act. Speaker Pelosi's office has been wonderful in leading this charge.
Mhm.
People don't know how valuable she is. I think they're starting to see how valuable she is
Mhm.
and what a leader and a champion of this legislation she is in her office. And so we need all of the stories out there coming out, stories as gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, whatever. And they need to be crafted. And some people don't understand this. But again, you have to look at your audience when you're telling stories.
Mhm.
So, in a way that legislators can understand, yes, I'm in your district and this impacts me and this is how.
Mhm.
But we also need letters from allies. No
Yeah.
movement has ever existed or made it without allies. And
Yes.
those are the parents, the aunts and uncles, the teachers, the mentors, the whomever. One of the biggest things, I loved hearing from my students is that I was their biggest cheerleader.
Mhm.
And to
Yeah.
me, that's what I want to be, their biggest cheerleader.
Yeah.
And that makes my day because then I know they're the best person that they can be. And so we need those allies as well, saying, yes, I taught this person for whatever number of years, just like all of my teachers have still been my champions. And
Yeah.
most of my former bosses, because they know what a good worker I am.
Yeah.
And we need those people to champion out there too, to their legislators. And it's
Mhm.
not only the storyteller, everybody can tell that story that I know a trans person or I am a trans person, and this is how this impacts their lives without this legislation or why we need this legislation.
Yeah.
So there are many groups working on this, but contacting your legislators and getting this done is
Mhm.
the most important thing we can do right now. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
because all the other is just static noise.
Yeah.
But this is something that we are still pushing forward and working on, and we can still get work done to push this forward, as well as turning out votes.
Mhm.
We turned the House favorably. We need to keep it that way, and we need to get the Senate that way, and of course, we need to get the White House so that
Yeah.
we can make this an actuality. Because we then will not be marginalized anymore.
Yeah. So thank you for that push on the legislation side. You're doing your advocacy job here. One of the things that I think is really powerful in what you said is around legislation in general. It's very difficult to pass a bill without the context of how it will impact, a representative's district or a senator's, like people in the senator's state, right? And so that's the power. Like stories are 100% needed, and I could say like a very kind of like logical, I'm kind of moved by numbers and facts. It's like, but you have all the facts here. Like it's kind of a no-brainer, but I've seen this so many times. You can show up in a legislator's office or, even in the context of the workplace, trying to get a CEO to care about diversity, equity, and inclusion or belonging. Sometimes, even when you have all the data points to, yes, this is a no-brainer. It's the one story that relates to the person that you're talking or sharing with. That one story is often the thing that's like, okay, where do I sign up? How do we do this? I'm rolling up my sleeves. I'm ready to do the work. And I'm always amazed by that. This like, it just took that one story and there you go. And
Yes.
now we're off to the races. So I appreciate that. A really important reminder. The other thing that you mentioned is the power of allies, and I think that leads in nicely to this next question, which is, there are a number of audience members, and I think this goes back to how you kicked off the interview, Kylar, in talking about students, and encouraging them to think about their own diversity stories, and sometimes in working with students, and even for folks viewing this right now, some folks might be struggling of like, but I don't really have a diversity story. I don't quite get this. And so I think this feeds into the role of allies, right? But okay, that's the context. So for folks who haven't considered their own lived experiences as a source for content, for sharing their diversity story, what advice can you offer them to help them kind of excavate, refine, and then have the confidence of sharing something that feels vulnerable to them to make connection with other people in the workplace and more broadly in their lives?
That's a great question, because as I told each and every one of my students, everyone has a story to tell. And each and every one of you have a diversity story to tell, whether you realize it or not. You have a friend, family member, you have somebody you know that's LGBTQ,
Mm-hmm.
and you either have forgotten or haven't sat down, pardon me, over coffee and had a good chat with them about what's going on. And I think sometimes we just forget, because my friends forget, because I have been doing so many things that they don't think about the problems that trans people have. And they don't, because they see me functioning and doing all these things. And then I have to remind them, including my own physician, that trans people make $10,000 a year and are in distress. And he's like, oh, yeah, you might be having some stress now, because he just has seen me over the years doing 50 million things and not having any stress at all.
Yeah.
So we have to be reminded of those things. So I'd say, first of all, take a piece of paper or a pen and sit down and reflect for a few minutes and gather your thoughts and think about it, because you have a story in there. And remember a time when something happened to your friend or family member that just wasn't right, that comes to mind.
Yep.
And if you can't do that, then you need to have coffee with your friends and gather that story. And then think about how you're going to sell that to the legislator, just on the conversation that I've had here with roads today. One, think about first how you're going to connect with your legislator. I'm Joe James, and I live in your district and have been there for X amount of years, or the state, and you're my representative. I voted for you in the last election, or if you didn't, leave it out. And I have a friend named whoever, or no name, doesn't have to be a name, but that happens to be transgender, and they've been my friend for 20 years. And then just explain your story as briefly and succinctly as possible, but you then tell them that you're in support of the Equality Act. Make sure you give the bill number and name, because they won't have it or know it, because they get so many letters. And ask and make your ask, just like I did. Is you're only good. We all hate salespeople, right? But we're really selling here. And so then make your ask and tell them you want them to vote for the Equality Act. And this because it's necessary. And that's what you do, and sign your name. So keep it simple, keep it short.
No, I just want to kind of like reframe this, because I think it's brilliant, right? And so this speaks to the expertise that you bring, in which you are definitely 100% in the business of kind of educating and raising awareness to elected officials, the type of change we need to see in order to stand up for folks in the workplace that are still experiencing pervasive discrimination, like trans folks, LGBT folks broadly. And so I just wanted to reframe it just a little bit, because I think the guidance that you're sharing is awesome. And so for folks in the context of the workplace, right? Like if you're advocating for more funding for your diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, right? Like similar to what Kylar's talking about, is kind of reflect on why this work matters to you. Remember a time that you may have worked with a colleague who experienced some form of discrimination, or not even, it doesn't have to be overt. It could be a microaggression. It could be, the culture of the office that needs to change, but some kind of experience, if not related to yourself, to maybe someone else that you care about in the workplace. And then kind of thinking about, who are you talking to? So again, going back to knowing your audience, who's in charge of the budget, for programs that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And similar to your legislator, get to know, what motivates them, what do they care about, and draw connections to this work and how they can see themselves in it to kind of buy in. And then just making the request, kind of talking about why more resources might be needed, why more staff might be needed in order to really bake into your workplace culture this kind of feeling of belonging and defining what that means. So
Right.
I just wanted to reframe that because I think the steps are 100% right. And again, this could, if you're trying to advocate for a piece of legislation, it works. If you're trying to make a case inside of your own organization, it also works. It's just a different audience and a slightly different approach.
And
Yeah,
excellent, Rose, and thanks for doing that, because
yeah,
I agree. It's slightly different approach. And again, in your workplace letter, you're going to be offering to support that initiative in some way, whether you're going to
yeah.
put time in there your own way.
Yep.
Again, you're offering to a solution as well as making a request.
Yes, 100%. So we've covered a lot of ground, Kylar, and I wanted to give the floor to you in terms of for our participants, knowing who they are. What's maybe one thing about diversity storytelling that we haven't yet covered that you feel passionately about? You want the audience just to kind of walk away with maybe one or two more ideas about why they should consider their own stories and share them when they feel safe and comfortable.
Well, the biggest thing is I don't feel, I'm glad you're doing this, because I don't feel people feel comfortable enough to share stories, and I see it less and less.
Yeah.
We see other types of actions people are willing to do, but storytelling has become a lost art in lots of ways. And I see people try to shut down even storytelling because they don't understand that it's a necessary and it's a way to connect us.
Yeah.
And we are disconnected by the devices we have, including me. I walk and text all the time because I'm multitasking and running to people on the sidewalk. And
Yep.
honestly, I would rather text you than talk to you sometimes as much as I talk. You go, this guy talks like crazy, right? But honestly, I'm an introvert. So
Yeah.
I'd rather text you than talk to you.
Yeah.
And so we're losing that art form.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that so if we lose that communication style, then we don't win. And I think that's why we're in the moment of time that we are,
Yeah.
because we've lost the art of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Just look at the way our family structures are. And by that, I mean, we used to get a lot of our family by storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And now everybody has a device in the same room and we communicate with each other via the device.
Yeah.
Just saying. So that's one of the things. And two, storytelling is the most powerful way to communicate with people.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that because people love to have me come and speak, and that is my pocket. And I realize that even more and more each day, because as I've started back on the road, I do trainings and people love me for trainings, but they love me more for a motivational speaker. Last month I've been out on the road the last few months, and people are dying for storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
They're missing it. They need it. Our country needs it right now, because we're missing that connectivity. Of hearing about each other and supporting each other.
Yeah.
And I honestly was amazed because I had, I just work, and had made some assumptions. But when I got back out there, I really see that people, and they're telling me they're craving that connectivity and need for storytelling.
Yeah.
So people need to be connected in this way. And there's a big openness for it. So I think your bosses will love it and need it, because I'm seeing that's the way companies are functioning. And I think it'll benefit all generations,
Mm-hmm.
upward and downward, however you want to see them, or across, and your company. And I think that it will bring people together. And I remember working in a large corporation. It's an international corporation, and we felt like a family.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked in smaller organizations that didn't feel like families in recent years.
Yeah.
But I worked in that large mega corporation, and we were family.
Mm-hmm.
And I relate that to the art of storytelling because and there was a book that was a common read from how the company grew, and it was passed on by storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love what you're saying. And I think you really kind of highlighted again some of the really important points. And it's about kind of opening up discourse. And I think a few things that popped out for me as you were speaking were being curious enough. If someone's being vulnerable and sharing their story, be open to receiving it, because that's a gift. Someone is
Great.
revealing another dimension of who they are. And I think that makes connection if you're open to it. And then it kind of bridges divides, right? So
Yes.
if I think the stat is something like 20% of adult Americans either know someone who's transgender or work with someone who's transgender, and that's actually almost double the number a decade ago, right? But it's still so small,
Yes.
right? So if you've never met
Yes.
someone who's trans, being open enough to kind of hearing us talk today is a big step in just trying to see the world from a different perspective. And I think one of the other things that you said is stories change minds, they open hearts, and I think that they save lives too, because for you, in 2012, in terms of trans visibility, you, Shannon, a lot of other folks kind of led the way of stepping out and being visible, right? And just by doing that, probably, like a good portion of those text messages or emails you receive from younger trans people were just like, thank you, like seeing you there gives me hope about my future. Or I mean, and we can never, I think that's the impact that, we can hear those, that kind of feedback. But I think for every message that you receive like that, there are probably hundreds of other people that, for whatever reasons, they haven't reached out to you, but you still had that positive impact on them. So I do think stories do save lives, especially if they're stories that aren't a part of a dominant narrative, right? They're not out in the media every day. And so as one trans person to another, thank you for everything that you continue to do, because you are an incredible leader. And I want to thank you for your time today. I learned a lot, and I hope that many people who've tuned in are also inspired to kind of sit down and follow your directives of kind of reflecting on their own stories, and when to share them in the workplace to kind of open up more minds and to kind of bridge divides. So Kylar, thank you. And for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all of these sessions and other helpful goodies using the link that's included below. And for every purchase that you make, it helps me pay for incredible speakers like Kylar for sharing their generosity, wisdom, and all of the labor that they've put into helping us grow the belonging movement. So thank you, and thanks again to our featured belonging champion today, Kylar Broadus. Kylar, quickly, before we go, where is the best place to find you online?
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful working with you. The best place to find me is at www.kylarbroadus.com.
Awesome. And we will include that and all the information about this particular talk. So thanks again, Kylar, and thanks for everyone for joining us.